Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. Today we finally get into the browser, and we're not going to be writing code to demonstrate things or alert messages or something like that. Well, we're still going to do that, but we finally get to learn how to start targeting the browser, because essentially the browser is an operating system. Just like we write applications that run inside of our normal operating system like Windows or OS X or something like that, we write applications that are websites that run inside of the browser. So all of the code that we write is targeting the browser, and it gives us many objects that we can use to not only access the browser itself, but also manipulate things within the page. So the browser gives us a hierarchy of objects, and at the very top of this hierarchy is the window object, and that's what we are going to talk about today, is the window object. If you remember back to day 5, whenever we talked about scope, I said that there are two levels of scope. The functional scope, which anything defined inside of a function is only accessible from that function, and then global scope, where anything defined as global is accessible throughout the entire web page. Well, whenever you define a global variable or function, you're actually creating a property or a method of the window object. So let's look at an example. Let's create a global variable called foo. We'll give it a value of hello window. And normally we've used this variable just by specifying its name. But let's call the alert function and do window.foo. We will see an alert window pop up saying hello window. And the reason why this happens is because we created foo as global, and therefore it gets attached to the window object, which is our global scope. It's our global object. So we can use the foo variable by specifying window.foo, but we typically don't want to do that because window is automatically implied for us. In the case of foo, we can just use the foo variable and our code will still work. So we can specify window.foo if we wanted to, but most of the time we don't. And if window is automatically being implied for our foo variable, it makes sense that window is also being implied for our alert function. The alert function is actually a method of the window object. So if we run this again in the browser, we will see the same results. So we've been using the window object all this time. It's just been hidden from us. If you remember from day 2 or day 3, I don't remember which one, but whenever we talked about the parseInt and the parseFloat functions, we used those to convert a string to a number. Well, those two are also methods of the window object. So window.parseInt and window.parseFloat. These are all methods of the window object. But once again, we typically don't want to specify the window object because it's automatically implied for us. But there are some times when it makes sense to do so. Like, for example, when you want to explicitly access a global variable. So, for example, let's create a function called bar. And inside of this function, we are going to create a foo variable. So we're going to call this hello function. Because foo is being created as a local variable to the bar function, it is overriding the global foo variable. So if we call alerts foo, we will see the value hello function inside of the alert box. And we went through all of this whenever we were talking about scope, so I'm just reminding you of this. Well, let's say that we wanted to actually access the global foo variable. Well, we do that by simply specifying window.foo. If we go back, refresh, then we see hello window. So in the case of overriding variables inside of a function, we can use the window object to access those global variables that have a same name. But here's the thing about global variables and functions. We don't want to use them. Because they are global, they are accessible not only by our code, but by code that we bring in from someone else. Like, say, we find some cool effect that we want to use on our web page. It might be some jQuery plugin or something, but we want to use it. It's JavaScript driven, so we add a reference to that JavaScript source file into our web page. Well, their code uses a global variable called foo, and it assigns it a value of 10. Well, we already have a global variable of foo, and our code is dependent upon this foo variable being a string and having some type of value that means something to us. But at the same time, the third party's code uses a global variable of foo. They're depending on that being a number. So either our code or their code is going to break based upon whatever code gets loaded first. In the case of this particular example, their code is going to get loaded after ours, so they are going to overwrite our foo variable with their value of 10, breaking our code. But if our code was loaded after theirs, we would break their code. So it's really not the fault of the third party or our fault. Well, it's both of our faults basically for using global variables. So instead of specifying global variables, what we end up doing is using what's called an immediately invoked function. And we put all of our code inside of these functions so that whenever this function executes, all of our code is actually treated as local variables and functions to that immediately invoked function, therefore protecting our code from being overwritten by anyone else's code. And in case if that's clear as mud, let's look at an example. An immediately invoked function is typically an anonymous function. It doesn't have to be, but that's typically what we do. And in order to execute an anonymous function, all we have to do is specify the calling parentheses at the end of the function declaration. But this code actually doesn't work because we begin the statement with the function keyword. The JavaScript engine is thinking that we want to declare a function with a name, like so. Well, we don't want to do that. Of course we could, but we typically don't want to do that. So instead, we wrap this entire function inside of a set of parentheses. And this allows us to execute this function. So then we just copy and paste, or cut and paste rather, our code inside of this function, making the foo variable and the bar function no longer globally accessible. They are not defined in the global scope anymore. Therefore, they are completely protected because they are inside of our immediately invoked function. So whenever we execute this code, line 8 is going to display a value of undefined because window.foo no longer exists. So just to show you, let's go to the browser, refresh, undefined. So the benefit of using immediately invoked functions is that anything defined inside of that function is protected from outside interference. So any third-party code can use a foo variable and it will not do anything to our code whatsoever, which is absolute paramount as far as code integrity. Now there is a slight little drawback, and that is whenever you override a variable, which we've done with line 6 inside of the bar function, now we can no longer get to the foo variable defined on line 3 while we're inside of the bar function. So inside of bar, foo is always going to refer to the local foo variable to the bar function. We cannot access the outer foo as we could using window.foo if foo was global. But that's just a small price to pay, and really we typically don't ever want to override variables. There are some very good times that we want to, but 99% of the time we don't. There are two more things that I want to show you today. The first is the confirm dialog box. Now the window object actually gives us 3 dialog boxes. One of those is alert, which obviously we've seen. The second is confirm, which we will look at in a moment. And then the third is prompt. Prompt is used to prompt the user for input so that they can type something into a box and then we can get that value. But there's much better ways of getting input from the user, so we're not even going to talk about prompt, but we will talk about confirm because it does have its uses. Its purpose is to present the user to make a yes or no choice. So it displays a message that we specify, and then whatever value that the user chooses, which is OK or cancel, which in our case would be true or false, then we can do something based upon their decision. So for example, we can use an if statement. We can call the confirm function, or I guess we can start saying method now, because this is a method of the window object. We use the confirm method a lot like alert, except that it returns a value. So we just have to pass in a question to the confirm method, and then it will display that dialog box for us. So we can say, do you want to go to google.com? Why not? And then whatever the user chooses, it's going to be OK or cancel. That's going to return a Boolean value, and then we will do something based upon whether or not the user wants to go to google.com. So we can say alert will take you there. And then we can use an else statement to say that you'll stay here. So if we run this in the browser, we will see a dialog box asking us if we want to go to google.com. Now I should have added a question mark there, but that's okay. And we have two choices, OK and cancel. If we choose OK, that's going to return true, and we will see a message that says we'll take you there. So let's reload the page to execute our code again, and let's choose cancel. That's going to return false, and we'll see the message, you'll stay here. Now naturally that's not very useful. Well, making the decision is useful, but we're asking the user if we want to go to google.com, but we don't actually go there. So that's where the second thing that I want to show you comes into play. And it is the location object. It is actually a property of the window object, but as I said before, window is automatically implied. So all we have to do is use the location object. And this gives us access to the location text box within the browser. We can get the value of the location bar, or we can set the value, which will actually take the browser to whatever URL that we specify. So let's first get the value. So let's create a variable called href, and we will just use location. There's also a property called href that basically gets us the same information, but you can just use location and that would be just fine. And let's alert that value. Yeah, let's go ahead and run the complete code I was thinking about commenting all those lines out, but I decided not to. So there we go. We are getting the complete URL, including the protocol, by using the location object. And let's go through these dialogues again. And then we can also set a value to location to take the browser to whatever URL that we specify. So since we are asking the user if we want to go to google.com, if they choose OK, then, well, let's take them there. So let's do location equals HTTP, blah, 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 google.com. Let's go back, refresh. And now if we choose OK, it's actually going to take us to google.com. There we go. I was about to say, or not, but there we go. So the location object gives us the ability to get and set the URL that is currently displayed within the browser window. And then we can also use the confirm method to give the user a decision to do something. In the case of like web applications where we need to delete something from a database, through JavaScript we can prompt them saying, are you sure you want to delete these records? And if they choose yes, then we delete them. If not, we do not. That's a little bit more complicated because then we have to tie in server-side code and all that wonderful stuff, but that's way more advanced than we want to get into. Location, confirm. As far as scope is concerned, we talked about the immediately invoked functions and how we should pretty much always use them to protect our code from outside interference. We also learned that the window object is our global scope, and anything we define as global ends up being a property or a method of the window object. So that is going to finish up today's lesson. In the next lesson, we will go one step down the hierarchy within the browser, which is the document. And we will start talking about the document object model, because that's where all the really cool stuff is, that we can manipulate things within the page, change them, make them fly across the screen, and all that wonderful stuff. So have a good one. I will see you next time.